Well, hello, amazing parents, and welcome back to Raising Amazing Kids. I'm Amy Hayes, founder of Raising Amazing Kids and creator of God's Blueprint for Raising World Changers. And in this video, I wanted to address a question or a topic that comes up frequently in my teachings and in people I speak with. And I feel like I just needed to address it in a separate video and tackle it head on. So here we go. And that is the question: are children born sinful? Are they born with sin? Are they born driven by their sin nature? This has been a common belief in the Western church, specifically in the U.S. church, because of the influence of the early American settlers, in particular the Puritans and the Pilgrims. They were Dutch reformists who were um, heavily inspired by, or what's the word? Anyway, they were influenced by John Calvin, and John Calvin perpetuated the idea that humans were born completely separated from God. And so that was a foundational belief they had, and it caused them to live in great fear and performance and just always examining themselves, worried whether or not they were actually saved or not. And so and they saw their children as needing basically to have the hell beat out of them, for lack of a better term, because they believed they were born complete. It was called total depravity, completely separate from God. In other words, in complete darkness and sin when they were born. So that's really affected and influenced the American church. But before that, what was the common belief? I like to go back to, I tell you what, let's start with where I think we should always start, which is the words of Jesus. You should always start with Jesus. You should always start with the Gospels whenever you have a question, including salvation. But we're not going to talk about that today. That's a topic for another day. But let's see what Jesus said about children. He specifically addresses and mentions children a couple of times in the Gospel of Matthew, and they're pretty profound statements that he makes. He doesn't elaborate a lot. There's not anything addressed to children, because obviously children are not going to be reading these, the law and the scriptures, but he does talk about them twice. So I want to start with Matthew 18:3, where Jesus says, quote, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as a little child, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." So that's a pretty strong statement. First of all, he starts out by saying, you can be sure of this. He says, assuredly. This is a sure statement. Unless you are converted and become as a little child, there's no other way, no other means for you to enter the kingdom of heaven. So I've heard a lot of teachers talk about this passage, and but they always focus on, well, what was the quality in children that Jesus was referring to? Well, I want to back up a little bit from that and just look at what he said. Just face value. He said we had to become like little children if we wanted to enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying that children are fit for heaven. He's not telling children to become like us. He's not saying children who follow me or any qualifiers there. He just says, unless you become like little children, you can't get into heaven, which tells me that children are fit for heaven. Little children are fit for heaven. So let me ask you this. Are sinners qualified for heaven? Well, no, obviously not. Can sinners enter heaven? No, you have to be innocent of sin, free of all sin, not guilty. And so we can conclude from just this statement here that Jesus spoke that children are fit for heaven, so they must be sinless, okay? Now let's look at, that's enough for me, but I've got more I'll share with you. Everyone has their own paradigm, their own background, and a lot of these things have been ingrained in us. And we really need to see and step back and see what the scriptures say and evaluate our beliefs, because the reality is, and we'll get to this more at the end of this teaching, but that it's for lack of knowledge that my people perish. And if you think about the schemes of the enemy, when does he want to, get us? He doesn't wait till we're grown adults to start trying to steal our souls. And so if he can work through us to affect our children, he's going to do that because we have the greatest influence as parents in our children's lives. So let me try and stay on my notes or I'll talk forever. Sorry about that. I do it all the time. There's another verse in Matthew 19:4 where Jesus says, to such as these, he's talking about little children. He says, let the little children come to me. We're all familiar with that passage. And do not hinder them. And then the second half of that verse says, for to such as these belongs the kingdom of heaven. So once again, he's saying little children possess the kingdom of heaven. So we have to ask ourselves, can little children be sinners if Jesus is saying to such as these, ones like this, like little children, possess the kingdom of heaven? So we have to say, well, they must not be if he's using them as the measuring stick, as the comparison. So those two verses are pretty strong. Then there's a parallel verse in the Old Testament, and this is in Deuteronomy 1:39. It's a pretty obscure verse, but it's not an obscure incident. But I discovered this verse as I was studying this out. It's a much, much bigger revelation, but I'm just kind of sharing part of it with you today. But I was studying this out, and I discovered this verse, and it's in Deuteronomy 1:39. And the context is when the children of Israel when Moses first delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, and they went to the banks of the Jordan River, the promised land, and God said, I'm going to give you this land. And Moses sent 12 spies over to spy out the land, and when they came back, they said, it doesn't look possible. There's giants, there's too many of them, we'll never be able to do it. And so they refused to enter the promised land, and that's what caused them to wander in the desert for 40 years. It didn't take 40 years to get to the promised land. It only took about 2 or 3 weeks. But because of their unbelief, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until that entire generation died off. So let's look at this verse. So in Deuteronomy 1:39, it's after they've refused to go in because of their fear. God is speaking to the nation of Israel, and he says to them, moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be victims, who this day have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess it. Now, the promised land is a picture. Everything in the Old Testament is a picture of what we have in the spiritual, in the New Covenant, in the New Testament. And so the promised land is a picture of heaven. It's a picture of eternal life. It's a picture of the abundant life. It's everything that was, Jesus came to restore. That picture of that restored life from everything that was lost in the garden, Jesus restored it, is the promised land. It's a land flowing of milk and honey where everything we need is provided. We're protected by God, protected and provided for. And so that's what the promised land represents. So we can kind of equate it with heaven or eternal life. And so in this verse, he's saying he's going to give it to the little children, or to the little ones and the children. But the older generation, we're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they all died. And then the little ones by that point would have grown up and are going to go in. He says, I'm going to give it to them. So why were the children qualified, but the adults were not? Well, I mean, you could reason it out at several different ways. And you could say, well, the children weren't involved in the decision to not go in. Even though God said he would give it to them, they decided, no, we don't think we can do it. We don't believe God, basically. And so you could say that they weren't involved in that decision. But what was it behind the decision? Because God always looks at the motivation of our heart, not necessarily our actions. So, we could guess, they were afraid. Yeah, they were afraid. But in the book of Hebrews, in chapters 3 and 4, it tells us very distinctly why they couldn't enter in the promised land. In chapter 3, it spells it out for us in verse 19 that they could not enter in because of unbelief. So it was unbelief. They didn't believe God. They didn't believe him because they didn't know him. They didn't trust him. They'd only been out of Egypt for a couple of weeks. And although they'd seen some pretty mighty signs like the Red Sea parting and manna coming from heaven and water coming from a rock, they didn't have enough of a relationship with him to trust him. And if you don't trust somebody, you're not going to believe them. And if you don't believe them, you're not going to obey them. And so it was the foundation of their unbelief, or their fear, was their unbelief. They didn't believe God. They didn't believe what he said was true. He said, I'm going to give you this land. I mean, if you remember when they finally did go in, they didn't really have to fight. They just did what God said, and he made sure it all worked out in their favor. So anyway, so what was it about the children that qualified them? So if it was unbelief that disqualified the adults, then we could assume that the children believed, or at least they didn't not believe, right? So we're going to tie these two together. Going back to Matthew 18:3, where Jesus said, unless you're converted and become as a little child, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, what's required to be saved? You have to believe, right? Well, that's something that that children do naturally. And so we're going to look at this. They're actually wired to believe. God's wired them that way on purpose. So we're going to talk more about this in the next video.